Well, Shavua Tov, everyone. The mics are on. If you have trouble hearing us, please just say something. This is such a treat. For those who don't know Dr. Flora Cassen,
Do I need to bring this closer or it works?
Can everyone hear her? Does she need it closer?
You hear me? Yes. Great.
So I first got to know Dr. Cassen as the mother of two wonderful CRCers over here. Little shout out. And then I discovered what a remarkable scholar she is. She is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. In fact, we ran into each other in New York in September when we were there studying, and she was there teaching. And I have to tell you, this is one of the most remarkable, affecting books that I have read in years. I just inhaled this book. It blends the story of your family. It blends the story of European and American anti-Semitism. It blends your expertise as a historian and your expertise as a human being in your family. It crosses the Atlantic over and over again and deals with profound questions of the ways that identity changes based on place. And so it is a true pleasure to be here with Dr. Cassen, with Flora.
Thank you.
And so let's welcome her, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So before we jump in, you have an exciting new position at Brandeis. I was hoping you would just tell us about what this is and give us some insight there.
Yeah, so Brandeis has 5 or 6, depends how you count, different Jewish studies centers. And at some point, do I need to put this closer? And at some point, they realized that each center has their own area of expertise and became sort of specialized in their own area and a little bit siloed. And so they decided to create a kind of center of centers to bring them all together and see what more we can do when all the centers work together. And so that's the position I got, which is very exciting, yeah.
The position is to be the head of this center of centers.
Yes, the head of the center of centers.
As I said yesterday, she's quite the macher. So let's jump into this book. So I wanted to start with the image that is on the front cover and the image that is the first of these chapters. Just to give us a sense, who here has read any of this book so far? Great, we have lots of copies here also, so we're happy to connect you with that. One of the pieces that makes this book, I think, so accessible is that so many of the chapters are just a few pages long. You can really digest them on their own. So will you take us through the opening story that you have in here, why you chose it to begin, why you chose it to frame the entire book?
So the book starts in the cathedral in Brussels, which is, I don't know if anyone's been to the cathedral in Brussels. It's really, one of these beautiful, amazing European cathedrals. And the entire cathedral is devoted to an accusation that goes back to 1370 that the Jews of Brussels stole the wafers, the Eucharistic wafers from the church, and then tortured them. And I think 6 Jewish men were burnt at the stake as a result of that accusation, and then the rest of the community was expelled. And after that, the cathedral wasn't yet built when it happened, but then the cathedral was built, and they preserved you can still see them actually, the wafers that were allegedly tortured, so many centuries ago are still there. But the entire visual program of the cathedral, in one way or another, tells that story. In the windows, in the tapestries, in the paintings, and it's remarkable once you realize that it's not just one image, it's the entire cathedral. And those images were added over the centuries, and the last that were added in the 19th century. and those images were actually paid for by the royal family. Leopold I, Leopold II, the first two kings of Belgium, paid for these gigantic stained glass windows. There's 10 on each side, and they tell the story. And one of those windows is very graphic, and that's the cover of the book, because you see a group of Jews, and they're hunched over, and they're kind of caricatured with big noses, and they have daggers, and you see them piercing the wafers, and the wafers bleed. And that's it's called the miracle of that cathedral, and it attracts a lot of visitors, pilgrims, hosts. What's interesting is that a couple years ago, while I was working on it, I went back to the cathedral to look at the image, take some pictures. And while we were there, the guardian of the cathedral, and actually Adam might remember that, approached me and said, "Are you Jewish?" And I said yes, and I thought, I'm going to get kicked out of the cathedral right now. But I wasn't, and he went on to apologize, to say, "I'm so sorry, I actually want the worship of those wafers to stop and end, but of course we can't stop people who, come and worship those things." So, there was a sense that it was there, but at the same time, there never was an acknowledgement of the fact that it was a slander and a false accusation. And for the Belgian Jewish community, that was always very painful, right? When you think about it, Belgium's the capital of Brussels. It's also the capital of the EU. And at its center, you have that cathedral. And on the one hand, it's centuries ago, and maybe no one cares. But on the other hand, it's still part of what's being publicly displayed in the city. And very interestingly, and unrelated to my book, last week the cathedral put a new plaque under that image. It's small, but it's there, and finally it says, it puts it in context. It doesn't say those images or this accusation is false, but it said there were many such accusations in the Middle Ages, and the church asks the Jewish people for forgiveness. So when I saw that, I thought it's very moving.
So I'm struck that you walk into this cathedral and you are asked if you are Jewish.
Right.
This is one of the recurring themes within
Right.
this book, a Jewishness that seems almost attached, that you can't escape from. But the other theme that this is parallel to in the book, I think, at least this is how I read it, is that you came to the United States and all of a sudden you were read as European.
Right.
I'm wondering if you'd talk about the relationship between those two things.
So it's very interesting because it's something I grew up with, and I describe it in the book, these sort of recurring events where randomly at a swimming pool or in that church, or, people just ask me, "Are you Jewish?" As if, it's somehow written, on my face or something like that, even though, I think, dress in a Jewish way or do anything to look particularly Jewish, but there's a sense as if maybe the way in which I move in the world somehow gives it up, or at least in Europe. And it's interesting because I grew up with that and I thought it's my experience, but then as I was working on the book and talked to a lot of friends, family members in Belgium, I realized they all have that same experience, that sense of walking around in the world and people just, knowing that they're Jewish. And I remember moving to the US and that thing disappeared because people thought, "Oh, she's European, she's so cool," And I never thought I'm particularly cool, but, I was kind of a dork. I moved to the US to do my PhD, and, when I arrived here, I lost my suitcase, never arrived. And I was miserable because I had, packed all my favorite clothes and so on. And, my first 2 days, I was at Brandeis, actually. I just went to the bookstore and I bought a couple shirts and a hoodie, and that's what I wore. And then after a few days, I just went into the city because I realized that the suitcase isn't going to arrive. And I bought whatever I could find and afford, as a grad student. And then people would tell me, oh, I love how you dress. You must, you're lucky that you get all, you could do all that shopping in Europe. And I thought to myself, it's funny because it's from the Brandeis bookstore and the Gap. But yeah, so I guess it made me sensitive to, right, these kind of small things of how people are recognized in the world. And it's interesting because I wrote my PhD on the Jewish badge, on the, Jews in Renaissance Italy had to wear a yellow badge or a yellow hat. And I remember when I defended it, at my defense, I said something that, I remember a day when I was in college in Brussels, I was sitting on the steps with a friend. And in those years, it was the years when they started the Erasmus program, and so you had kids from all over Europe going to different universities. And we were sitting on the steps and looking at people, and we kind of were guessing if they were Italian or French or Spanish or whatever. And I think we were right 90% of the time. And so I kind of said that at my defense because we were talking about that idea. And I remember one of my professors saying, there's no way you can do that. And I thought, okay, But I think there are these codes that when you grow up in a place, they're unsaid and they're subtle, but you can recognize them. And so I think there's something in the way that this works. And it's not always easy to define, but it's very much there.
So I was hoping you'd take us back to your childhood. And in particular, this image that stuck with me of your youth group space in Mala's house.
Yeah, so this woman called Mala Zimmerbaum I grew up in Antwerp in Belgium. And she was a woman who, like my grandmother in a way that I talk about in my book, she had emigrated from Poland to Antwerp in the mid-1920s and was deported to Auschwitz in, I guess, 1942, 43. And I think she's one of the only people who managed to escape the camp. She fell in love with I guess a Polish prisoner, and I think they dressed up as he as a guard and she as a prisoner, and they were able to escape. And so they were on the run for a couple of weeks, and then they were caught and brought back to the camp, and where she was publicly executed. And her execution kind of became the stuff of legends because I think she started to speak just before she was executed and told people that, it was by then, she had heard that there was going to be the Allies were going to come and it was going to be the end of the war and so on. And so she told people, I'm going to die, but you guys need to survive. This is going to end. There's another story that she would have slapped one of the SS guardians who was there and who was going to execute her. So there are all kinds of stories about her, and nobody exactly knows, what happened that day when she was executed. But anyway, because she was from Antwerp, she became kind of our local hero. And as a child, there was a youth group called Anor Hatzioni, which was like the Zionist youth group, which was her youth group when she was a child in Antwerp. And it was in that, it met every Saturday afternoon in that house that was completely broken and run down. Like, I would never let my kids, play every afternoon in a house like that. Like, there were holes in the wall, and you could feel things creak, and there was no working bathroom. And on the other hand, it was fun because our parents would drop us off and there was no adult supervision, just teenagers hanging out there, having a lot of sweets and trying to understand, things about the world and what it means to be Jewish and what it means that there's a Jewish state and so on. And at the same time, I think thinking back and what it represents in the book is that kind of ambivalence, I think, of a Jewish community where, everybody's a survivor in Antwerp because it's in Europe, it's in Western Europe. And all our grandparents were survivors, and they all decided to, wherever they had been before, to settle there and stay. And on the one hand, they were telling us, and our parents were telling us, you're Belgian and life is good here. And on the other hand, it felt like we had a secluded life, like almost in a bubble. And thinking back, it seems almost like that house represented that ambivalence. Like, how do you build a community in a place where society betrayed you that much, right? Where suddenly it didn't mean anything anymore that you were citizen. And I'm talking about the 1980s. It's a time before even, there was even a minimal acknowledgement of the levels of collaboration. But of course, people knew and remembered. And Antwerp in particular in Belgium had very high levels of collaboration. And so there's really that ambivalence of, we rebuild, but we can't really rebuild in a place that, I think still carries the marks of so much suffering and so much betrayal, right? How can you trust that now it means something to be a citizen? And so I often think back to that house, that it kind of captures that ambivalence, because I grew up there and I have fond memories, and it felt like our house, and at the same time it was totally broken. And so I think there's that duality there.
So one of the core themes, at least that I have extracted from this book, is the way that your own sense of identity changes when you move from culture to culture. I want to talk about your grandparents in just a moment. But before we get there, I was hoping you could reflect on how your understanding of your own Jewishness, and maybe of what it means to be Jewish publicly, changed when you came to America. And in particular, how you viewed your European experience differently in an American light, and if we can layer 15 layers on top of here, how it feels raising two American, Jewish, European, Belgian, I don't know what dashes we want to put there, but kids in this country.
Well, now I'm afraid to say anything because they are here, and I will hear them later on if I say anything that they don't like. I mean, I'm excited for them. I think they're incredibly lucky to grow up in this country. I mean, it's a complicated place, especially right now. But one of the things that I discovered when I moved here, and I didn't expect it, I thought I knew what it's like to be Jewish, and I came to do a PhD and to study. And very quickly, I discovered that the American Jewish community is completely different from the community that I knew in Europe. It's large, and it's confident, and it's extremely alive and creative. And, even Reform Judaism, I didn't know it growing up, there were just, two schools, and they're both very Orthodox, and, you just go, and it is what it is. And then here, I think it's wonderful. You have people who are constantly figuring out what it means to be Jewish and American, and how to conjugate that to, every taste and every sauce. And I'm just watching it, and I think it's amazing. And I think there is something here that I never knew back in Europe, and that I love. And I know that, American Jews are always down on themselves because they're not good enough, and they're not doing this well enough, and they're not good allies, and they're not good this, and they're not good that. And I get it, but at the same time, I think that what people built, what Jewish Americans built in this country, this network of synagogues and federations and JCCs and organizations, and even the past few years, with the crisis post-October 7, we've seen new Jewish organizations come up, and people, continue to sort of really try and figure it out, and I think that's absolutely remarkable, and so I think my kids are lucky to grow up here and to see that. I mean, even Brandeis, we were talking about it, I just went back there for a job, but I remember when I learned that there's in America a university that was founded by the Jewish community, and that's an R1 school. And that's not the Boston Federation that says that Brandeis is an R1 school. These are criteria defined by the best universities in this country. And what Jewish community in the history of Jewish communities has managed to do that? I mean, it's quite remarkable. And, so that's...
How has it changed how you look back on your own childhood as a Jew and your understanding of anti-Semitism, of European memory, of...
It's made me very, I guess, hopeful about, this country and the Jewish community in this country, but it's also made me understand, I guess, the impact of what happened in Europe in a different light. And I realized also over time that, I left because I wanted to do a PhD. But now when I go back in the summer, every summer there's fewer Jewish people in Belgium, right? Most people my generation have left for one reason or another. It wasn't like a mass exodus because there was a pogrom or something happened, but, one person, fell in love and left, and another person got a job elsewhere. And so, one after the other, everybody leaves. And at some point you realize it's part of a trend. And, I don't think everybody will leave. There will always be Jews in Europe, but at some point you have to ask if, is what we're seeing the end of a 2,000-year-long history? Because over time the trend is that fewer and fewer people are staying. And if you think of, everything that was created, whether it's Ashkenazi Jewry, Sephardi Jewry, like these cultures of, these literatures, the foods, I mean, all these things that started out in Europe and that we now see all over the world. And it's sad for me to even have to wonder about that question, and to think that there used to be a time where probably the vitality that I see here existed there too, and it just doesn't. And to me that's very sad.
I think you mentioned the number that's sticking with me is that from the 70s until today, the European Jewish population has declined by 60%.
Yeah, I think I have a table in the book. I don't know the precise number, but I mean, I think even in 1945, at the end of World War II, you still have, I think, close to 3 million Jews in Europe. And today it's maybe around 1 million. So there's been a decline. And you can also take a longer view, right? You can take a longer view over, say, the past 200 years, where, right, you have a lot of Jews from Russia and Eastern Europe. Most of them moved to this country in the late 19th, early 20th century. Mid-20th century, right, whoever was left in Eastern and Central Europe, most of them were massacred. And then if there was one place where Jewish life was going to pick up again in Europe, it was Western Europe. It was, right, Belgium, France, the Netherlands. And, I think France is slightly different because you had a lot of people who came in the 1960s and 70s, but even there, you have a crisis and a lot of people are leaving. I think if you walk around, Tel Aviv today, you hear more French than English almost, right? So there's something, I think that in that rebuilding hasn't worked out. And I don't want to blame it all on anti-Semitism. I think that's a big reason, but I also think the ambivalence we were talking about before is another part of what's happening. I think at some point people maybe felt, we can't trust that society anymore. Whatever we do, we can't put down the roots that we did before.
So I think this is maybe a moment to back away. You talk about the lachrymose theory of Jewish history and then the rejection of that. I'm hoping you can first of all explain to all of us what you mean by those terms, but also talk about where this book fits into that. I certainly understood it as sort of a critique of the anti-lachrymose school, but...
Yeah, so when I guess started my PhD, it was in like 2000, right? The theory that most scholars of Jewish history, applied and believed in was that idea of a rejection of what they called the lachrymose history, the idea that Jewish history was a long succession of persecution, and one succeeded the other, and so it's a history of tears, right, from the Latin word for tears, and their argument was that if you only focus on what went wrong and the persecution and the hardships, you're missing a lot. You're missing everything that went right. You're missing the culture and the creation. And I think that's true. Actually, I agree with that, right? So when I started my PhD and I started studying that, it was like a light bulb went off in my mind, because I had grown up in this slightly probably lachrymose environment and community, and I thought, yeah, that's so true, right? I mean, you take the long span of Jewish history. So many good and incredible things happened, and you also don't want to take away people's agency historically, right? Even when things were difficult, they still built and created, and that's totally remarkable. And I think what I say in the book is that to an extent it went too far, because I remember in 2014 there was a shooting in the Jewish Museum in Brussels. Someone went into the museum and just shot 4 people. And then a couple months later, you had, the Charlie Hebdo attack in Paris. And then after that, a kosher grocery store was also shot. And then I think a few months later, there was something at a synagogue in Copenhagen. And so there was a situation where over the course of a year, in the center of Europe, you had a series of shootings, and I think 9-10 people were just murdered in the streets of Europe because they're Jewish, and that's in 2014, 15. And I remember looking at that and thinking, I'm a historian of Jewish history. That's what I study, and I was totally shocked, and I didn't see this coming, and I didn't couldn't fully quite understand how it connected to what came before. And I kind of felt that maybe lachrymose idea had gone so far that we couldn't even connect one event to another. There was that idea that because if you connect them all in a chain of events, then you're sort of again forgetting about everything else, but you're kind of distorting history, because something happens in say Paris in 1340, and then something happens in Spain in 1420, you can't really connect those two things. They're in different places, they're in different times, but that's what the lachrymose theory had done. And so the push was to disconnect all these elements, to all these events, to only study them in their own context. And I felt, and here I am in 2015, and I don't understand what happened. And so in the book, I kind of take, and maybe it's we'll see what people say, maybe it's slightly controversial, right? But I take a much longer view in which I say, yeah, you don't need to connect every event, but there are ideas that stay in culture and that impact people who live in different places, in different times, right? Ideas that sort of travel through time. And in some ways, I think the cathedral, right, is a kind of, maybe allegory for that, because it steps away from where the shooting in the Jewish Museum happened. And what was interesting was that, of course, the next day after the shooting happened in the Jewish Museum, the whole conversation is about Israel-Palestine, right? This must have happened because of what happened in the Middle East. And I thought to myself, why is something that happens, on the other side of the Mediterranean Sea more relevant than imagery that's been there for centuries and renewed, right? I mean, the latest windows were placed in the 19th century. Why is that one thing more relevant than the other? Why aren't we looking at things more in their local, maybe historical context? And so, yeah, I'm sort of pushing back against the theory in this way, not rejecting the notion that, Jewish culture and creativity should be ignored or forgotten, but sort of pushing back against the idea that, we can't even connect one event to the other.
So I'd love to talk about your grandparents. They, in some ways, I think, are the center of this book. Everything else revolves around this story. So we start, just tell us a little bit about them, and then I have some questions.
So it's there. I mean, there's a lot of things that I could tell you about my grandparents, but what I put in the book is the story of how they survived the Holocaust. And so they lived in Antwerp when the Germans invaded. And my grandmother actually tried to flee with her family. In fact, during World War I, a small corner of Belgium had not been invaded because the army had flooded all the rivers. And so the northwestern corner of the country had not been invaded. And so as soon as they attacked in 1940, you have the entire country that's on the road and trying to get to that corner. But of course, they were still in their mind fighting the previous war. And this was a very different and far more powerful German army. And so that didn't work, and they found themselves in Antwerp in 1940, living under occupation. They didn't know each other. They met, in fact, during the war. And at some point, they realized, it's quite late. It's the summer of 1940. The deportation started in June, and I think a month before, my grandfather had received a letter saying, he had to go for work in Germany, and by then he'd understood that that wasn't a good idea. And he told my grandmother that he was going to leave, and then asked her to leave with him. And so they decided to live together. And that started a kind of 9-month-long trek through Belgium, France, southern France, where they thought, in the fall of 1942, it was still the free zone. But I mean, the free zone it's a misnomer. It's Vichy France, right? It's a highly collaborative government. And so going from one place to the other, and I put all the details in the book, but I'm not going to tell them all here. They finally make it to southern France, and they quickly realize that they can't stay there. The hotels where they stay get raided every night, and they're looking for foreign Jews. They're trying to get out. They're trying to get visas. They're trying to get passports. That's the story of Jewish refugees that we know, right? You need papers to leave, but it's impossible to get those papers. And so eventually they decide to just walk across the Pyrenees and try to make it to Spain. My grandmother was pregnant by then because, what else do you do when you're 21 and you're on the run from, the Nazis? And so they they walked her. She was 5 months pregnant. I mean, there were parts that my grandfather had to carry her because it was so hard. And they make it on the other side of the border. So they cross the Spanish border. They make it on the other side of the border, and the Spanish police is waiting for them there. And so the thought is that perhaps, right, their guides got caught and told them, or their guides just told the police that they just, helped 2 Jews cross the border. And so they get arrested, and they want to send them back. And my grandmother is by then, because she had walked for, 2 days in the mountains, being, 5 months pregnant, she's in such bad shape that they decide to, give them a few days, and they leave them in this small hotel in a town with, under police guard, and they say, we're going to come back in a couple of days and bring you back to France. And of course, if they had done that, they would have been put on the deportation train, and that was it. And somehow, my grandfather was able to place a phone call to the Belgian consul in Madrid. I don't know how he was able to do that. And that guy didn't save any Jews, right? That's not what he was doing. But in the conversation, my grandfather tells him that he actually fought as a soldier in the Belgian army during the invasion in 1940. And he actually fought very bravely because he received a medal for his bravery after the war was over. He was, one of the only soldiers, I think, in his company that survived. And so he received a medal for his bravery. And when he says that to the consul says, oh, actually, I was asked to send soldiers to join the Belgian army in Africa. If you agree to do that, I'll get you out of there. So, what does he say? He says yes. And so they finally get a piece of paper that's real and legitimate. And they make it to Madrid. From Madrid, they're sent to Lisbon. And next thing they know, they're on a ship to the Belgian Congo. And they arrive in the Belgian Congo. And there it's just a complete change of circumstances. These 2 young Jews had been persecuted and on the run for the past 9 months, and now they can join the sort of ranks of the Belgian colonial elite in the Congo. My grandfather is made the commander of a whole company of black soldiers, and he has to, command them and discipline them when they misbehave. My grandmother has her baby. The baby almost doesn't survive, but then eventually does survive. And then just before she gets out of the hospital, she's told that she has to, hire quote-unquote boys, right, black servants, to help her in her house. And at first she's like, what is this? Well, can you explain? And then people explain to her that, this is how we live here. We have black servants to do everything, to cook, to clean, to take care of the kids, right? And so before she knows it, she suddenly has a household with, 6 different servants. My grandfather is the commander of a company of soldiers, and their lives are suddenly completely different, right? Everything that was taken away from them, that sort of bourgeois, nice life that they aspire to, right? That's what they wanted to have in Belgium, that had been taken away because they were Jewish. They kind of get it back in the Congo. They continue to suffer from anti-Semitism in these, social ways. They weren't invited to birthday parties. People made anti-Semitic comments around them. They struggled to make friends. And so they very much felt different, and my grandmother said that a lot. We were completely different from the other colonists. The other colonists, they had come here for their careers. They wanted to move to Africa. It was their plan and their idea. And for us, I don't even know how we landed there, but it was a land of exile, and the minute the war was over, they left, right? The minute they could leave, they were out of there. But still, for 3 years, they lived that life. And, it's interesting how the histories we inherit we like to think of ourselves, we're on the side of, those who suffered or those who inflicted suffering, right? Those who were oppressed or those who were oppressors. And at some point, once I started understanding the history of my grandparents better, I thought, I'm kind of both, I inherited a legacy of, right, Holocaust. And of course, there are families that stayed in Belgium. They were all massacred and so on. So there's that grief and that pain that comes with, family members who survived the Holocaust. And then there's that sense of having grown up in a country that is known as, one of the worst colonial regimes in Africa. And I also inherited that legacy. And how do you deal with that? And for a long time, I felt very uncomfortable about it. Like, I only wanted one side. I didn't want both. And and in a way, I think and I say that in the book, I didn't ask my grandmother. I'm lucky she was a writer, and so she wrote about it, and I have those writings, but I almost never asked her questions about it. And I blame myself in a way, in retrospect, because I thought, it was my discomfort. We have to deal with, what people did in the past. For them, it was their lives. They were just trying to survive in a crazy world, and what else could they do? And because of my discomfort of knowing the history and understanding it and having those ideas about what was right and what was wrong, I didn't ask the questions I wish in retrospect I had asked. But I'm lucky that she was a writer and wrote about it.
So I'd like to take your grandparents' legacy back to this side of the Atlantic for a moment. You spend much of the latter part of the book talking about a post-COVID and post-October 7th reality of anti-Semitism in the United States. A small tangent, but I don't think I had processed fully the impact of COVID on anti-Semitism. So this is one of the lingering takeaways I have from this book. But I'm wondering if you would take that legacy and that hesitation and the complicated nature of your understanding of your grandparents and talk about what it means to be an American Jew in this moment, in a post-October 7th world, in a post-destruction of Gaza world, in a world where victim and victimizer are not clean. And then maybe bring it to our campuses to make this even more complicated.
It's complicated. I think one of the things that I'm trying to do in the book is show that we can do it. We can sort of grapple with this moment that we're living in without having to erase one side or the other. And I think that's what I try to do with my grandparents' story, that, if I can tell their story and grapple with it, maybe we in the current moment can acknowledge both the reality of anti-Semitism and the shock of seeing it rise so fast, especially after October 7. And at the same time, the reality of the destruction and the devastation of Gaza. And I think acknowledging one, we can acknowledge both, right? Acknowledging one doesn't mean that we have to deny the other. So I think that is one of the things that I try to do in the book. And one of the things that I find has been hard in the conversations we've been having in the past couple of years is you always have to pick a side, right? You always have to be on one side or the other. You always have to, if you're on one side, then you're completely not on the other side. And we're constantly pushed into these binaries, into signing a statement for one or signing a statement for the other, or taking a position here or taking a position there. And even on university campuses, and that's what's been, in some ways, for me, because my entire career has been on university campuses, and seen that even on campuses, well, campuses overwhelmingly, it seemed, right, picked one side, and then it was, and I think it still is, it was and it still is very difficult to have balanced conversations about that, without being told that, you're a fascist, or you're on the wrong side of history, or right, and so I think that's, for me, has been very hard, has to see these kind of totalizing narratives, in a way, take over, both in society and on campuses. And I've seen them on both sides, by the way, right? If you talk about anti-Semitism, you have people who are saying, like, everything is anti-Semitism, and I think that's a problem. And you've had people who are saying nothing is, right? Whatever's happening on campus, it's just all free speech, and it's never anti-Semitism, and that's a problem too. And so I have found that that's very hard, and I try to model a different type of conversation in the book with my grandparents' story, but also with those chapters in the end, where I try to muddle my way through those difficulties. And it's funny. I remember after Trump was elected the first time, and I went to a lot of protests, and at the time I lived in North Carolina, and a colleague said to me, until you really take positions that make you feel uncomfortable, and because you're pushing back against, right, the powers that be and so on, you're not doing enough, you're not doing it right. And I think, almost, 10 years later now, it's a paradox almost, but the most uncomfortable position to be is wanting to hold on to complexity. Because if you pick one side or the other, you're surrounded by people who agree with you at this point, right? And that's today, I think, the most uncomfortable place to be, and that's the place I decided to be in this book. So, yeah.
I'm wondering, have you read the book Learning from the Germans by Susan Neiman?
No.
I thought of it throughout reading your book and throughout this conversation. She's the head of the Einstein School in Berlin, and wrote this book looking at how Germans remember the Holocaust and comparing it to how Americans remember the enslavement of black folk and the genocide of native folk. And really, it's this very sort of positive look at the way Germans have done this. And I know when I went to Germany, I found it very inspiring that there are Holocaust memorials everywhere. They're built into the cobblestones. They're in the main public square of Berlin. It struck me that there's a pessimism around how much this can really make us and our cultures better that I found within your book. And I just want to bring one other piece. I gave a High Holy Day drash about this book a few years ago, and afterwards I emailed Susan Neiman a copy of it. And I heard back, it was one of the most depressing emails I've ever gotten, that she really appreciated me sending it, and that she deeply regrets writing this book.
Interesting.
That it has failed, that it has done the opposite of what she had hoped, and that she wishes she'd never put the book out into the universe.
That's interesting. It's interesting because I remember your drash, and I remember having a similar thought. That thinking, yeah, I wish I could be that optimistic as you were. I think grappling with history is difficult. I think the Germans have done it impressively well. Certainly, the generation that came of age in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, they really, right, they, I think, rejected their parents' silence and looked at history in the eyes. I think you have a younger generation there today that sort of has reacted against that. But more broadly, it's very difficult, and we see it here with the legacy of slavery and the Civil War and so on that this country is still grappling with, and it's difficult. And there's no reason why it wouldn't be just as difficult in Europe, talking about events that actually, happen in some ways more recently. And I always, I think when Americans looked at Europe and they looked at the right memorials and so on, and they always said, oh, like the grass is greener there, they're doing it so much better. And I always felt, having grown up there, that, it's not as simple as you think. And, Germans had to do it because they provoked the war. But everybody else, for much of the 20th century, could say it was the Germans, right? It wasn't us. And when the Germans left, it was, all over. And it's only in the 1990s that sort of, right, grappling with history of collaboration has started. It's also in the 1990s that, for example, right, European countries started paying reparations, much of it because of, American pressure, interestingly. It's not like they woke up and they thought, oh, this is the right thing to do, we're going to do it. I remember it was during the Clinton years, what was his name, Eisenstadt, right? He was the ambassador in Brussels. And he pushed for that, and he pushed the Swiss bank, and they want business with America, you better pay some reparations. And I remember thinking at first that it's amazing, and that kind of claims conference, they were like starting to look into, right, all of Europe into reparations and paying back. And then very quickly, what I started hearing from people is resentment. It's like, why? Why should we pay that? It's our grandparents, and maybe it's not even our grandparents. Not everybody was a collaborator. And I think what's interesting is that, right, when you're here and you have Holocaust museums in every city in America, including St. Louis, which, always surprised me. Not St. Louis in particular, but that you have so many. All over the country, because it's easier to grapple with something that happened elsewhere. But in reality, if you think about Europe, everybody suffered during German occupation. It was much harder if you're Jewish, right? But nobody enjoyed it. Every family has stories of, imprisonment and deprivation and bombing, and they all wanted liberation, but they all knew that it was going to come with, an Allied invasion and bombing of their houses and their cities, and it was terrifying and it was scary. And suddenly in the 1990s, all we're talking about is Jews, right? And I think it was necessary, but at the same time, I think it maybe could have been done in a better way, in a way that fosters reconciliation rather than a kind of memory competition. And in many ways, that's what we've seen, that every different groups of people just felt that their memories were forgotten because suddenly we're paying so much attention to what happened to that group of people. And so I think, right, in addition to that sort of having to grapple with an image of your country that maybe is not how you imagined it, the notion that, well, but even the war was complicated and occupation was complicated, and we maybe didn't, pay enough attention to that. I don't know. Sometimes I say that in the book, and I don't really believe that because I'm a historian, and I think, history is the most important thing. But sometimes I wonder if maybe things would have been better in Europe today for the Jewish community if there had not been, all that focus on Holocaust memory, reparations, building memorials and museums. Many people again attribute the rise of anti-Semitism to the Second Intifada. It happened at the same time. But again, why is that more impactful than the fact that that's when suddenly people were forced to look at what happened here, and there was a backlash in America after Obama became president, right? And everybody understood that it was not because of what happened in another place of the world, but because of what the history that happened here. And so sometimes I feel that, the backlash is a much bigger source of the problem than what is usually admitted, and that it's kind of easy to always blame it on the Middle East. Not that we shouldn't talk about that, we should, and of course, I'm horrified by the devastation of Gaza and everything else, but at the same time, if we don't take responsibility for what happens in our countries, and we think it's going to be resolved if conflicts in other places are resolved, I think that's a mistake.
So I have one last question, and then we'll open it up to questions from everyone here. I was struck, again, in the latter half of the book, you talk about the confidence that American Jews bring to political advocacy as American Jews, right? We show up and we have Jews for abortion rights signs, Jews for trans kids signs, Jews for... I feel like maybe I was on the front lines of the peak of this.
Yeah, maybe.
I sat with hundreds, probably thousands of Jews in Jeff City around trans kids and around abortion and around reasonable gun control and all of these sorts of issues that are core to our community, and sat as we spoke as Jews with the full confidence of belonging in America. What I saw legislators go from being interested in us to being overtly anti-Semitic. I saw the flip. I want to combine that with another piece here and then get your thoughts, because you also talk about the different definitions of anti-Semitism, and we've just gone through something of a rupture or a struggle in our own local Jewish community around this. And my strongest feeling during this sort of internal Jewish debate about the IRA definition and about the law that just recently passed in Missouri was that the same legislators who I had seen turn into overt anti-Semites were the same legislators pushing for the IRA definition to be encoded into law in our state. It continues to just boggle my mind. So there's a lot there, but I would love to just...
Can you talk more about the anti-Semitism that you felt and how that...
Oh, gosh,
like
yeah.
The kind of comments or what...
Yeah, over and over again. When I first started going to Jeff City, I would sit there and I would testify in these, we can just be clear here, we're talking about Republican legislators in our supermajority Republican legislature. These Republican legislators, folks like Mike Moon and Dean Plocker, and they would sit up when I would speak. He was a rabbi and a man and in a suit, and they would listen, and we'd go out into the hallway and they'd ask me questions afterwards. And then the second, third, fourth time, all of a sudden it was, oh, those Jews. All of a sudden it was this discovery that we weren't who they imagined us to be. And instead of loving and treating us, philo-Semitism, it just flipped. And it became really overt anti-Semitism, to the point where, when I think of the most virulent anti-Semites I know, most of them work in the Missouri legislature. And most of them co-sponsored the IRA anti-Semitism bills. And it's just, I don't know what to do with that, and I would love your thoughts on this.
I'm not sure what to do with that either.
Low-hanging fruit here. It's easy questions.
I think what we've been through, in the past couple of years with that sort of resurgence of anti-Semitism, I think it's been confusing because it has, reappeared in maybe ways that, we didn't anticipate or expect, right? I think there was that idea that, right, anti-Semites are people with, swastika tattoos and shaved heads, and right, we know who they are, and it seems to me that what we have seen is part of probably a much broader breakdown of maybe tolerance and acceptance of difference in our society. That I think it hasn't only affected Jews, and I think as a result, I'm not so surprised that it came from, different segments of society, and the cynicism is interesting, right? I mean, they make these comments and then they vote to pass a law, and I think we maybe put too much stock and hope in laws when really, if there's a breakdown of the norms that make it possible for people in pluralistic societies to live together, laws aren't going to repair that, because at the end of the day, we live in a society where the most important principle is freedom of speech, right? You can say anything. So I think society in some ways is good at, policing those norms, right? We teach our kids to be polite. There are a lot of things that, you can say or you cannot say, and there's no law for that. And in recent years, what we've seen is that a lot of things that we used to know that we can't say, well, suddenly we can say them. And I think that's the problem that we're dealing with, is that we live in a society right now that has abdicated that responsibility of, enforcing those norms in a social way. And what do you do when that happens? And I think that's why, right, those laws feel cynical. And I think the debates about definition that I think I say in the book, we've had one definition after the other, and none of them work, because we're in that sort of dynamic situation where things happen, and it's very hard to keep up with these laws. But I think the reality is that most people probably kind of know when they transgress. And they do it anyway because it somehow has become permitted. And how do you, right, start enforcing those norms again? And in pluralistic societies where the whole point is that people from different backgrounds and ethnicities and religions can live together, if those norms break down, it's very difficult to maintain pluralism in general. And, it's interesting because I was talking with a colleague recently who just did a study across different campuses, and he kind of wanted to know who are the groups on campuses that are anti-Semitic. And so he went, and I think he managed to have a survey of 4,000 students, from students across America, from different Jewish groups, but from white students, black students, other minority students, and asked all these questions. And he said to me, the conclusion is that each group of students feels discriminated against, all of them. And he said, I was very depressed to realize that. I thought I was going to figure out that this group is really the one that's responsible for the most anti-Semitism, and so this is where our sort of energies need to focus. And he said what he discovered is that all of them feel that they themselves are discriminated against, and they don't actually see that other kids feel the same, right? So they can see it when it happens to them. They're oblivious when it happens to others, and I think in a way that's the flip side of that sort of liberation of transgression or transgressive speech that we've seen, is that a lot of people are suffering and not really seeing when it happens to others.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
You are as fascinating as your book.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's give her a round of applause. Is there someone who would be our question moderator, microphone walker around her? That's a technical term.
I can volunteer.
Oh, Leslie,
I
thank
can
you.
volunteer one of the kids.
I was going to
If
volunteer one
they-
of your kids too,
Yeah.
so you know.
You want to do it? I think he wants to do it.
So please, if you have a question, put up a hand and yeah, Karen.
There.
Hi, I was
Hi.
raised Catholic, and I am old enough to remember when in the Good Friday liturgy particularly that it was, one of the prayers was for the conversion of the Jews specifically and all unbelievers. I am a convert to Judaism almost 10 years ago, and I did my master's thesis in Catholic theology, studying post-Holocaust theology, and I analyzed the theology of Edward Schillebeeckx, a Belgian theologian who taught at the Catholic University there. I am so struck by the cathedral and his very progressive, forward-thinking theology in the same country. Maybe he was responding, right, to that cathedral. After my graduation, I took a long period away from religious engagement. And when I returned to exploring different churches, so I did my thesis in the mid-90s, and I was struck by that's when we're really trying to do this work. But, you know, when I began engaging with religious traditions again, I was struck by the covert, systematic, unconscious anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism in very progressive Christian spaces, to the point where when I was in my conversion process, we're a multi-traditional family, I told Rabbi Susan I was not going to allow my kid to be formed by covert anti-Semitism within Christian tradition, just like I am going to work against systemic racism and not allow him to be formed by that as well. So there's this thing where I felt like it went really covert. I don't think that the deep work that was promised by things like Nostra Aetate, the World Council of Churches, and that this has a reinforcing, role in covert anti-Semitism, which then can flame up. So I just kind of want your input on that. I was literally shocked to hear these examples of anti-Judaism in very progressive churches. I can walk into any Christian church and tell you how much work they've done on it. And I've actually been in the Episcopal Cathedral with Jews at an ordination where they prayed for, and I was bracing for it, the conversion of unbelievers and seeing the shockwave go down, because it was the first time the other Jewish folks were at this type of ceremony.
What
Anyway,
a story,
so
yeah.
there's something about this covert reinforcement that happens all the time societally that I think then gets inflamed. So.
Yeah, no, and I think it's difficult because, the history of Judaism and Christianity are so intertwined, and the idea that Jews are responsible for the death of Christ, I mean, it's in the text, right? You can't really get around it, and so I think that the church, after Nostra Aetate, has done an amazing work at sort of teaching that, yes, this is what the text says, but we can't blame it on generations and generations of Jews thereafter. But it remains controversial. And just talking about the cathedral, in the 1960s, the Jewish community actually asked the church at the time to put a plaque. And the bishop, because it was right after Vatican II, right after Nostra Aetate, he was actually open to it. But he was faced with a rebellion from scholars from the Catholic University who said, no, you can't. And they wrote a report explaining that they can't put a plaque because there's not enough evidence to show that the Jews were not guilty, right? There's also no evidence that they were, but you know. And so the fact that now they did it, you know, and that they put a plaque under that image, to me, it's actually quite remarkable. But I also realized from the way it's been reported in the press, first of all, it's barely been reported. It's really somehow the current bishop who felt it's important and decided to do it. And I think there was one article in a newspaper that I saw, La Libre Belgique, and other than that, no noise. You know, you could have thought they might have made it a big deal, like, look, you know, Jewish-Catholic reconciliation in Belgium, but it remained very much under the radar, which is interesting because I think the reason is that it is still controversial, and I've been struck also when you mention progressive spaces by, you know, sort of the power of that old imagery and, you know, these old ideas, even in non-Christian progressive spaces, right, very secular ones, where you sometimes see that, you know, especially for someone like me who studied that, you see that anti-Jewish imagery, you know, reappear when, you know, of course it's legitimate and important to criticize, right, Israel's war in Gaza and what they're doing, and the fact that a lot of civilians were being killed in the process. But when instead of talking about specifics, suddenly people invoke that imagery of Jews drinking children's blood or something like that, you're thinking, you know, where does that come from in a very secular space, that very obviously old Christian anti-Jewish imagery? It's interesting, right? And that's where I, you know, felt also that push against some of the anti-lacrimose thing, because some of these ideas just somehow are, I don't know why, but somehow, yeah, somehow some stereotypes just stick.
First of all, I hope you have enough copies of the book, because I have 5
I hope
adult-
so.
We have
too.
boxes back there.
I have 5 adult children and 9 grandchildren and lots of friends, and so I'm
Thank
looking
you.
forward to reading
Thank
them.
you.
So my totally ignorant question is, number 1, how do you explain the inexplicable? And number 2, as a member of CRC, you must be an optimist. How are you optimistic?
So, you know, I kind of think optimism is something probably that's kind of maybe inborn in your personality. And I think maybe I have a little bit of that in me, so I'm remaining hopeful. On explaining the inexplicable, I have a chapter on the book on what it's like to teach anti-Semitism in college. And, you know, I say to students, what's interesting when you teach anti-Semitism is that, you know, you have to kind of read, and I focus on Europe, you have to read all the grades of European literature and thoughts. And I go through these texts with them, and we analyze them very seriously. And then sort of, and one day a student said to me, but now we read all of this and it all makes sense to me. And I thought, right, that how can you say it's wrong and it's nonsensical, and then take students through a semester of teaching text and getting through the subtlety so they understand what goes on in the mind of the author and what their ideas about Jews are and where they come from and what, right? And so, I feel that tension all the time when I teach, right? How do you explain the inexplicable? Because once you make it explainable and understandable, then isn't there a risk that you're saying, well, but if we can understand it and it makes sense, right, then it's okay, right? So there's that tension there. I think you need to understand, to need to know what you're dealing with, and to respond to it, or even to explain then after that why it's wrong. But I remember having that moment when the students said, "Oh, it just makes sense," thinking something's not going right there. I guess maybe just going back to what we talked about early on, just what I've seen the past few years, right? People aren't giving up. The American Jewish community isn't giving up. If they're not happy with the ADL, and then they're creating new organizations, right? There's like a group called Nexus that has come up, and I think they're doing very interesting work on, fighting and explaining anti-Semitism. There's a kind of energy and dynamism that I still see happening. I don't see people give up. And one other thing I say in the book, and maybe it's worth mentioning, not that it should make you optimistic, but it can maybe shift the perspective. I think sometimes history enlightens us, and sometimes it maybe hides what's really happening. And I think, we know the history of the Holocaust so well, with good reason, because, right, it's so horrible and it happened so recently, that whenever we think about anti-Semitism, we think about the Holocaust. And in reality, the Holocaust was a time where Jews were completely excluded from society and then massacred. And there was no, power and vulnerability and both happening at the same time and so on. And so I say in the book, if you look at other periods in Jewish history, you have examples where you have these two things, right? If you look at the early modern or medieval era, you have times when Jewish communities are doing quite well, and then you have times where, something happens and, they're persecuted, but then they recover and they rebuild. And so there's an entire history of that back and forth and of, right, experiencing this sort of sometimes ambivalence between power and vulnerability. And the Holocaust, in some ways, thankfully, is a one-time event, right? There's only been one complete and total genocide. And for most of Jewish history, Jewish communities have been incredibly resourceful and have been able to deal with adversity and recover and find solutions to very complicated questions in society. And my feeling is that today is more one of those times than a Holocaust again. I mean, I might be wrong. I'm not a prophet, but that's my impression. And I understand why we always think about the Holocaust, but I think we maybe reached a point where it's not helping us understand the present, and different pasts might help us understand the present better. And those are a little more hopeful, even though they're not perfect.
One last question, please. All the way in the back.
So I want to thank you both for a really wonderful conversation. For me, what was really important about it is that this conversation publicly has felt so loud. What Flora, you called expressing totalizing arguments, that it's been difficult to, it's difficult to sort of hear it any longer. And this was a quiet conversation. And as a quiet conversation, it allowed for that small, still voice to resonate. And that enables us to rethink these issues in powerful ways, and I really appreciated it. I have so many questions.
I'm sure you do.
But I want to
He's written a great book on anti-Semitism.
I want to ask kind of one question that sort of brings together two things, and that is, can you, Flora, talk a little bit, like step back a little bit and say some things now about how you would frame the academic conversation around anti-Semitism today? And do so maybe by elaborating a little bit more on the reflections that you offered about the Lacrimose theory of anti-Semitism, and specifically whether you can sort of reflect a little bit on the conversation that happened when you talked about your grandparents' story and you talked about the complications that it offers in terms of victims and like power and powerlessness, and whether instead of sort of going forward the way that you did from their moment to kind of contemporary discussions around issues of race and Israel today, whether you can kind of go backwards as a medievalist and early modern scholar, and whether or not because one thing about the lachrymose narrative is that it positions Jews as victims. And that seems to me problematic even when it comes to medieval or early modern history. So can you just sort of talk a little bit about where you think we are now, but also about the lachrymose narrative going backwards into a longer history into the Middle Ages?
I think where we are now and what I would like, I think it's interesting, and you know that, right? A lot of people are working on anti-Semitism. There's new anti-Semitism centers that have been created in a number of universities. There's postdocs in anti-Semitism studies. So it's a very, I want to say, happening field right now. And I think it still remains a field where people don't talk to one another, right? You know, in one university, it's that side of the debate. In another university, it's that side of the debate. And I wish we could bring that together, because I think that when you have a lot of smart people thinking about a complicated problem, it would be nice to find somehow a way to transcend those political lines and bring people together in the same room and see, what we can do. And, I've often learned things from people I disagree with. And even if in the end I still don't agree with them, I still sometimes have learned, right, something from their perspective. And so that's what I would like to see moving forward, if we can somehow do that. And I don't think it will be easy. About the lachrymose history moving backwards, I think what the rejection of that lachrymose history has done is that's maybe most important, is it's given back agency to Jewish communities who suffered in the past and who only, right, were seen and understood as victims. And it's interesting that it often occurred to me that while even, in the, say, 2015, 16, I was still steeped in that lachrymose idea, and I thought it's very important to always give agency to victims. And I was seeing people around me in different fields, sort of, whether you were looking at, gender studies or African American studies or whatever, or sort of really focusing on the lack of agency. And so I wonder if that's, a place where maybe other academic fields, when they look back, can maybe learn from the work of those Jewish historians, in the sense that even in the worst times, right, people made choices, made decisions, and I think my grandparents are an example of that, right? Their choices were constrained by life, and they probably made decisions that they would have never made if not, the fact that the world they lived in exploded and got destroyed. But then within that, there were still choices and decisions that they made every day. And I think in terms of, giving people their dignity, whatever the circumstances, I think that matters.
So one more time, let's give a big thank you to Dr. Flora Cassen.
Thank you.
Really, I can't recommend it enough. Buy this book, read this book, treasure this book. And in fact, with that, we'll go ahead and bring out copies of the book that folks can buy.